She was 5'4", wearing blue scrubs, and she had not slept in 11 hours. The four men who walked through those emergency room doors at 11:47 p.m. were not patients. They were not family. They move the way people move when they have already decided what they are going to do, and they are not interested in being told otherwise. The biggest one had a scar running from his left ear to the corner of his jaw. He scanned the room once, found what he was looking for, and started walking. The old man in bed 4 saw them first. He made a sound. Not quite a word, not quite a scream, something small and animal that came from a place deep in his chest. His hand shot out and grabbed the nearest thing it could find. It found the wrist of the nurse standing beside him. "They found me," he whispered. The nurse turned. She looked at the men. She looked back at the old man's face. She understood, not the details, not the why, but the important part. The part that mattered right now, at 11:47 p.m., in the emergency room of Callaway General Hospital in Denton, Colorado. She stepped between the old man and the 4 strangers walking toward him. She had no weapon. She had no backup. She had an IV line in one hand and 11 hours of exhaustion behind her eyes. And she did not move. If you've made it this far, do me a favor. Hit that follow button and stick with me until the end of this story. If this reaches you, drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this one travels. Her name was Nora Callahan, and she had been a registered nurse for 6 years, 4 of them in emergency medicine, the last 2 at Callaway General, which was the kind of mid-size hospital that handled everything from ski accidents in the winter to heat emergencies in July and never had quite enough staff to do it properly. She had dark red hair she kept in a bun that was always slightly falling apart by the end of a shift. She had a habit of chewing the cap of her pen when she was thinking. She was not, by any standard measure, the kind of person you would expect to stop 4 grown men from doing anything. But she had learned something early in her career in emergency medicine, something no textbook teaches, which is that a patient's fear is real information. It is data. When someone grabs your wrist and says they found me in a voice that sounds like the last air leaving a room, that is not a confused old man speaking. That is a person who has been running from something real, who has just run out of road. The patient's name was listed on his intake form as Harold Voss, 71, brought in by ambulance after a fall at his apartment on Meridian Street. Left wrist fracture, possible concussion, mild hypertension elevated by stress. That was what the form said. What the form did not say was why Harold Voss had kept his eyes on the entrance doors for the entire 2 hours since he arrived. Why he flinched every time someone in dark clothing passed his curtained bay. Why he had asked Nora, twice, if there was another exit besides the main one. She had chalked it up to anxiety. A lot of her elderly patients were anxious in the ER, especially at night, especially after falls. Falls frighten people in a particular way. They were a reminder of the body's betrayal, of how quickly control could disappear. She had held Harold's good hand and told him he was safe, and she had meant it. She had meant it until 11:47 p.m., when she learned she was wrong. The 4 men crossed the waiting area without stopping at the intake desk. That alone was enough. In Nora's experience, people who came to find someone in the emergency room stopped at the desk. They checked in. They asked which bed, which bay, which room. They followed the rules, even impatient ones, because hospitals have a gravity to them that makes most people behave. These 4 did not stop. They moved in a loose formation, big one in front, 2 flanking wide, 1 slightly behind on the left, and they were looking at the numbered bays along the wall like they already knew what they were looking for. Nora stepped out from Harold's bay. "Can I help you?" The words came out more controlled than she felt. She was aware of her own heartbeat in a way that she usually was not. The big one, the one with the scar, stopped about 8 feet from her. He looked her over once, the way you look at an object that is slightly in your way. "We're here for the old man," he said. "Harold Voss. Family." "Patient information is confidential," Nora said. "If you're family, I'll need ID and I'll need to go through admissions." "We don't need admissions." He took 1 step forward. "We just need Harold." "That's not how this works." She kept her voice flat. Not aggressive, not apologetic. She had learned a long time ago that apologetic was the wrong register for situations like this. It opened a door. You check in at the front desk, you provide identification, and if Mr. Voss consents to visitors, someone will come get you. That's the process. The big man looked at her for a moment with an expression that was almost curious, like she was a minor inconvenience that had turned out to be more durable than expected. Then he looked past her toward the bay where Harold was lying. "Harold!" he called out. His voice was loud enough to carry, loud enough to make heads turn across the waiting room. "Harold, it's time to go." From behind her curtain, Nora heard nothing. Then she heard Harold's breathing, shallow and fast, the sound of someone trying not to exist. "Sir," Nora's voice came out harder than before. "You need to stop. Step aside." "No." The word landed in the space between them like something physical. She watched his expression change, not into anger exactly, but into the particular blankness that precedes it. One of the men on the flank moved. He was younger, with a close-cut beard, and the kind of stillness in his body that was its own kind of warning. He stepped around a row of chairs and positioned himself to Nora's left, cutting off the angle to the nurse's station. She registered this. She did not look at him directly because looking at him directly would mean looking away from the big one, and the big one was the decision-maker. "Lady," the big one said, lower now, "you don't know what you're involved in. Just step back. Let us take him, and you go back to whatever you were doing. Nobody has any reason to bother you." "He's my patient," Nora said. "He's not going anywhere without a medical clearance and his own consent." "He's fine." "That's for his doctor to determine." The big man breathed out through his nose. He glanced at the one on her left. Just a glance, just a fraction of a second, and she felt the shift in the air before anything moved. The one on the left took 2 steps toward her. "Hey!" The voice came from across the waiting room. Not loud. Calm in a way that actually carried further than loud would have. I think she said no. But the waiting room of Callaway General's emergency department at midnight on a Tuesday was not crowded. A woman with a sleeping toddler in her lap. A teenage boy with his arm in a makeshift sling. A man in his late 40s sitting in one of the blue plastic chairs near the window. A paper cup of coffee on the armrest beside him. A little girl of maybe 9 asleep across 2 chairs with her head on his thigh, her ankle wrapped in a compression bandage. He had been there for about 40 minutes. He had not said much. He had gotten his daughter a cup of juice from the vending machine down the hall, and he had sat back down and he had waited. Nobody had paid him particular attention because there was nothing particular about him to pay attention to. He was medium height, medium build, wearing a gray jacket and dark jeans, 3-day stubble, the kind of tired that looks like the ordinary tiredness of a man who works too much and sleeps too little. He had a paperback on the chair beside him that he had not opened. When he spoke, 2 of the 4 men turned to look at him. The big one did not turn because the big one did not need to. He knew where his people were. The man in the gray jacket stood up slowly. He put his coffee cup down. He moved the paperback so it would not fall. He checked once, almost automatically, an unconscious gesture, that his daughter was still asleep, that her position was stable, and then he walked to the edge of the waiting area and stopped about 12 feet from the nearest of the 4 men. "There's a problem here," he said. "Mind your business," the one with the beard said. "Kinda hard when the business is happening right in front of me." Nora looked at him. She registered him. Gray jacket, calm face, no particular tension in his body that was visible from the outside. And she thought, "Don't, please don't. I don't need another person in danger." "Sir," she said, "please stay back." He looked at her. Something passed between them, brief and unreadable, the kind of communication that happens in emergencies between people who are not panicking, which is its own small miracle. "I'm not in anyone's way," he said. And he wasn't. He was just standing there. The man with the beard turned back to Nora. He had decided the man in the gray jacket was not a factor. That would turn out to be a significant miscalculation. Things happened quickly after that, the way things always happen quickly once the waiting is over. The big man took 2 steps toward Nora, not running, not rushing, just closing the distance in a way that made the option of her not moving seem suddenly unrealistic. She stood her ground, which meant he stopped 6 inches from her, close enough that she could smell cigarette smoke on his jacket, and he looked down at her and said very quietly, "Last chance." "Get the security desk on the phone," Nora called out over his shoulder, projecting toward the nurse's station without taking her eyes off his face. She heard movement behind the desk, heard someone picking up a receiver, heard the flat automated tone of an internal call connecting. The big man's hand came up and closed around her upper arm. Not violently, almost casually, the way you move a chair, the way you relocate an object, as though she were simply a thing in a hallway, and he was shifting her aside to pass. She planted her feet, he pulled. She did not go anywhere, which surprised him enough that there was a moment, just a moment, where he reassessed. That was when the man in the gray jacket moved. He crossed 12 feet in less time than it takes to describe. He did not run. He did not shout. His trajectory was direct and economical, and he arrived at the big man's right side as the big man was still processing the fact that Nora had not moved, and he did something with his right hand and the big man's grip on Nora's arm was simply gone. Not broken, released. Involuntarily, like a door opened from the inside. The big man stepped back. His expression was one of genuine surprise, which was maybe the most unsettling thing about it, because he was not a man who expected to be surprised. "Don't do that again," the man in the gray jacket said. He was not looking at the big man. He was looking at the other three. His name, though no one in that room knew it yet, was Daniel Reese. He was 44 years old. He had a daughter named Callie who had sprained her ankle badly enough to warrant x-rays after a fall during soccer practice, and he had driven her to the emergency room at 11:15 p.m. because his ex-wife was in Denver and the urgent care near their house had closed at 9. He had been hoping to be home by 1 in the morning. He had not been planning for this. But the thing about training, real training, the kind that lives in the body rather than the mind, is that it does not consult your plans. It does not ask whether tonight is convenient. It simply activates when the conditions that require it are present, and the conditions were present now. He had spent 11 years in the United States Army. 4 of those years as a Special Forces operator, 3rd Special Forces Group, 2 combat deployments to Afghanistan, and 1 to a place that did not appear on any official record. He had been a sergeant first class when he separated from the military, quietly and without ceremony. And he had come back to Colorado and gotten a job doing security consulting for a firm in Colorado Springs. And he had tried, with moderate success, to be unremarkable. He was particularly good at being unremarkable. He had worked at it. The man with the beard moved first. He came in fast from Nora's left, and Daniel turned into it rather than away from it, which is the thing that most people do not understand about someone who is trained for close-quarters situations. The instinct is always to move away from a threat, and the training is the rewiring of that instinct, the replacement of retreat with contact, because distance is only safety when you have a firearm and room to use it, and Daniel had neither. What he had was positioning and timing and 12 feet of space that he had maintained without appearing to maintain it. The man with the beard reached for him, and Daniel redirected the arm. Not a block, a redirect, turning the energy rather than fighting it. And then he was behind the man, and then he wasn't, because the third one had come around from the right, and Daniel stepped back once to reset his angles, and the third one's momentum carried him past and into a row of plastic chairs that clattered and went sideways. It was not graceful. It was loud and disruptive, and a woman across the waiting room made a sharp noise of alarm, and the toddler woke up and started crying. It was not anything like what people imagine when they think about combat training. It was closer to a car accident, abrupt, angular, no warning. The big man had recovered from his surprise. He came at Daniel from the front, which at least was honest. Daniel had maybe 2 seconds to decide how to handle someone this size in a space with a sleeping child 20 feet behind him, and a nurse in close proximity, and 3 other men in various states of recovery. And the decision he made was the one that minimized collateral. He went low, changed his center of gravity, and the big man's hands caught nothing but air as Daniel moved inside the reach. And what happened next was controlled and fast, and left the big man on the floor looking at the ceiling with his right arm extended in a direction that was uncomfortable enough to make further movement seem like a bad idea. "Stay there," Daniel said. The fourth man, the one who had been hanging back, looked at the two who were picking themselves up, at the big man on the floor, and then at Daniel. And something in his face made a calculation, and the calculation came out in favor of not finding out what happened next. He put his hands up. Not surrender exactly. More like a pause. Yet, across the waiting room, Nora stood between the curtained bay and the open space, and her heart was slamming against her sternum in a way that was going to leave her exhausted later when the adrenaline cleared. She was aware of the sounds around her, the crying toddler, the chairs that had been knocked over, the sound of the phone at the nurse's station being dropped and picked up again, the clatter of the big man's elbow against the linoleum. She was also aware of Harold. She pushed the curtain aside. He was sitting up in his bed, both hands pressed flat on the mattress, his face ashen, his eyes fixed on the doorway. His fractured wrist was in a temporary splint, and it looked wrong, the angle of it, and she thought distantly that he was going to hurt it worse if he didn't lay back down. "Harold." She kept her voice low. "Stay down. You're safe." "You don't understand," he said. "You can explain later. Right now I need you to stay in that bed." He looked at her with eyes that were red-rimmed and wet. "They're going to come back. Then we'll deal with that when it happens." She put her hand over his, careful of the splint. "But right now, in this room, you are safe, okay? Nothing is happening to you tonight." She didn't know if that was true, but she said it because he needed to hear it, and she said it in the voice she used when she needed a patient to believe something badly enough to stop fighting her. He lay back down, awed. The security team arrived 4 minutes after the internal call went out, 2 guards from the night staff. One of them, a big man named Phil, who Nora had worked alongside long enough to know he took his job seriously. They came through the side door at a near run and stopped at the scene. The big man sitting up on the floor rolling his shoulder, the one with the beard holding his forearm, the 4th man with his hands raised, the 3rd one who had hit the chairs now standing against the wall looking slightly dazed. Daniel Reese was standing in the middle of it all, with his hands at his sides and his breathing nearly normal, and he looked at Phil and said, "They came in without checking in, tried to remove a patient by force. The nurse over there has the details." Phil looked at him, looked at the room, looked at Nora. "That about right?" "That's right," Nora said. "I need police here as soon as possible, and I need someone with these 4 men until they arrive." Phil got on his radio. Daniel walked back across the waiting room. Callie was awake. She was sitting up in her 2 chairs, looking at her father with wide eyes and both hands pressed to her mouth. "Dad?" "I'm fine." He sat down beside her. He picked up his paper cup of coffee and found it was still warm. "How's your ankle?" "Dad?" "Callie." "What was—" She looked past him at the 4 men being moved toward the wall by the security guards. "Who are those people? What happened?" "Some people were bothering that nurse over there," he said. "It's handled now." Did you just—" "Your ankle," he said. "How does it feel?" She looked at him for a long moment with the specific look that children give parents when they have realized that the person they thought they knew contains rooms they have never entered. It is a look that is partly frightened and partly something else, something that comes before understanding, that clears the space for it. "It hurts," she said finally. "That means the swelling is real and not just bruising." He picked up the paperback he had never opened. "Good. That means the X-ray was the right call." The police arrived in 9 minutes. 2 officers first, then a 3rd, then a patrol supervisor who spoke quietly with Phil and then walked over to where Daniel was sitting with Callie. "Sir, I'm going to need to ask you a few questions." Daniel looked up. "Of course." "You were involved in the altercation?" "I intervened when one of the men grabbed the nurse." "And the injuries to the other parties were the minimum necessary to stop them from doing what they were trying to do?" He said it the way someone says the sky is blue, not defensively, not with explanation, just as a statement of fact. The officer looked at him for a moment. Then he wrote something in his notebook. Nora gave her statement at the nurse's station, one of the other nurses covering her bay while she talked, and she found that her hands were shaking slightly when she held the paper she had been handed to review. Not from fear, she thought, but from the particular delayed reaction that hits when the body finally has permission to feel what it was not allowed to feel during the event itself. Harold Voss had not said anything more after she laid him back down. He was still. His eyes were closed, but she could see from the tension in his forehead that he was not asleep. He was waiting. He had been waiting, she thought, for a very long time, and the wait was not over. She caught the patrol supervisor glancing toward Bay 4 twice while she was giving her statement. The third time, he excused himself and walked over to the curtain, and she heard him say, low and professional, "Mr. Voss, my name is Lieutenant Hargrove with the Denton Police Department. I'd like to speak with you when you feel ready." What she heard next was not Harold's answer. What she heard was the sound of the lieutenant's next breath changing, going from routine to something else, something cautious, as though whatever Harold had just said or shown him had shifted the shape of the situation considerably. She finished her statement. She looked across the waiting room. Daniel Reese was sitting in his plastic chair with his sleeping daughter's head back on his thigh. He had finally opened the paperback. He turned a page, as if nothing had happened, as if he were just a man in a gray jacket waiting for his daughter's X-ray results, passing time with a book, in the ordinary way of ordinary people. Lieutenant Hargrove emerged from behind the curtain of Bay 4. He got on his phone immediately, not his radio, his personal phone, and he walked to the far corner of the room with his back to the space and his voice low, and Nora could not hear what he said, but she watched his posture shift twice during the call, and she understood that whatever Harold Voss had told him, it had stopped being a simple assault case at Callaway General Emergency at midnight on a Tuesday. It had become something else. The big man with the scar was sitting against the wall with his wrists in zip cuffs, watching the room with flat eyes. He looked at Nora once. His expression said nothing legible except that he had done the math, and the math was not in his favor, and he had not finished deciding what to do about it. Then his eyes moved, past Nora, to Daniel Reese and the paperback and the sleeping girl, and they stayed there. Something crossed his face that Nora could not name in the moment. She would name it later, lying awake in the early morning when the shift was finally over. It was not surprise. It was not fear exactly. It was the specific expression of a man who has just realized that he reached into a dark room and grabbed something he did not understand yet, and who has just begun to suspect that what he grabbed back might be considerably more dangerous than anything he came here intending to find. The big man kept looking at Daniel Reese for another 30 seconds before he looked away. It was the kind of look that meant something had been filed, cataloged, like a man taking an inventory of a problem he was going to have to solve later when the zip cuffs were no longer a factor. Nora saw it. She was not sure anyone else did. She went back to work because there was nothing else to do, and because the patients in the other bays had needs that were not paused by what had just happened in the waiting area. The woman in Bay 2 needed her discharge paperwork. The teenager in Bay 6 had waited long enough for his laceration to be sutured. She moved through the tasks the way she always moved through a busy shift, one thing at a time, in order, without the luxury of dwelling on what came before or anticipating what came next. But her mind kept returning to Harold. He had not eaten the dinner tray that had been brought at 9. The untouched food was still on the swing arm table beside his bed, green beans and a roll and a cup of apple juice with the foil seal still on it. Nora cleared it when she checked his vitals at midnight, and she noticed that his blood pressure had come down slightly, which meant either the medication was working or the immediate threat had eased enough for his body to stop treating every heartbeat like a defensive measure. "How are you feeling?" she asked. "Old," Harold said. It was the first thing he had said to her in over an hour that wasn't about the 4 men, and something about it made her chest ache in a way she did not entirely have time for. "Your wrist needs to be properly set in the morning," she said. "Ortho consult first thing. You'll probably need a cast." "I've had worse." She noted it on his chart. She started to pull the curtain closed. "That man," Harold said. "The one who—" He stopped, started again. "Is he still out there?" Nora looked toward the waiting area. Daniel Reese had not moved from his chair. Callie was asleep again, her head back in her father's lap, her wrapped ankle elevated slightly on a second chair he had positioned at an angle for her. He was reading. "He's still there," she said. Harold was quiet for a moment. He's not what he looks like. No, Nora said. I don't think he is. She closed the curtain. Lieutenant Hargrove came back from his phone call with a different quality of attention than he'd left with. It was visible in the way he moved, slightly slower, slightly more deliberate, the body language of a man who is now gathering information rather than processing an incident report. He spoke again with the two officers who had handled the four men. He looked at the security footage on Phil's tablet, watching the waiting room camera's recording of the previous 45 minutes from several different angles. Twice he rewound to the same sequence and watched it again. Then he walked over to Daniel. Mr. Reese? Daniel looked up from his book. Lieutenant? I'd like to talk to you a bit more if you have time. My daughter's x-ray came back clear, Daniel said. Growth plate's fine. Moderate sprain. We're waiting on the discharge paperwork. Shouldn't be long. Hargrove settled into the chair across from him, the one nobody had been sitting in all night. He had a particular kind of practiced ease, a cop's ease, the kind that comes from years of sitting in rooms with people and knowing how to take up space without appearing threatening. You handled yourself out there. I did what the situation needed. Hargrove looked at his notebook, looked back up. You have any formal training? Martial arts? Military? Anything like that? Daniel turned a page. Some, he said. Hargrove waited. Daniel did not add anything. The big one, Garrett Peel. He's going to have some bruising on his shoulder for a week or so. Guy named Ruiz has a sprained wrist, maybe a hairline fracture. We'll see what the films say. You did all of that in under 40 seconds. I wasn't counting. I was, when I watched the tape. Hargrove leaned forward, slightly, elbows on his knees. Mr. Reese, what do you do for work? Security consulting, Colorado Springs. And before that? There was a pause, not a long one, but Nora, who was passing the waiting area with a supply tray and could not help overhearing, noticed it. Military, Daniel said. Which branch? Army. Long? Long enough. Hargrove wrote something down. He had the expression of a man who understood that he was being given the minimum and that pushing would not produce more, at least not here. He closed his notebook. What Garrett Peel and his people were in here for tonight, he said, is going to go a lot further than a simple assault charge. I want you to know that. Whatever you walked into, I want you to know we're taking it seriously. Daniel finally set the book down. He looked at the lieutenant directly for the first time in the conversation. The old man in Bay 4. Harold Voss. Is he going to have protection tonight? Hargrove met his eyes. I'm working on it. Work faster. The lieutenant stood up. He held Daniel's gaze for another second, and then he nodded, once, and went back to his phone. Okay. Nora finished the teenager's sutures at 12:50 and found herself standing at the coffee station trying to remember if she had eaten dinner. She hadn't. She found half a granola bar in her locker, ate it standing up, and went back out. At 1:15, the discharge paperwork was ready for Callie Reese. Nora brought it to the waiting room herself. She wasn't sure why. It could have gone with any of the nurses who were finishing their station rotations. But she found herself walking across the waiting area with the clipboard and the discharge instructions and the 2 prescriptions, ibuprofen dose schedule, compression wrap guidelines, follow-up in 5 to 7 days, and she stood in front of Daniel's chair and said, Your daughter's all set. He woke Callie gently, one hand on her shoulder, and the girl sat up blinking and looked around the waiting room with the disoriented expression of someone emerging from a dream they weren't quite done with. We're going, Daniel said. Already? Already. While Callie was reading the discharge sheet with the particular seriousness of a 9-year-old who has decided paperwork is important, Daniel stood up and looked at Nora. How's he doing? He didn't say Harold's name. He didn't need to. Stable, Nora said. Blood pressure's down. He's resting. You know what they were here for? She shook her head. The lieutenant hasn't told me anything, but I got the feeling from the way he made that phone call that it wasn't just... She stopped, started again. It's more complicated than I thought. Daniel looked at her for a moment. He had eyes that were hard to read. Not cold, but calibrated. like someone who had spent a long time choosing what to show and had gotten very good at choosing very little. "You did the right thing," he said, standing in front of him. "It's my job." "No," he said. "Plenty of people have jobs and still step back. That's not the same thing." She didn't have an answer for that. He didn't seem to need one. He put a hand on Callie's back and guided her toward the exit, and Nora watched them go, the little girl limping slightly but managing, her father's hand steady between her shoulder blades. And then the automatic doors opened, and they were gone. She stood there for a few seconds in the exact spot where 4 men had arrived uninvited, and a man in a gray jacket had stood up from a plastic chair, and she thought about what Harold had said. "He's not what he looks like." No, she thought, he really wasn't. What she did not know, what no one in that hospital knew yet, was that Hargrove's phone call had gone to his division commander, who had routed it within 11 minutes to a joint task force that had been running a quiet investigation for 14 months. The task force did not have a flashy name. It operated out of a shared office space in Denver that technically belonged to the state attorney general's financial crimes unit, and the people who worked there did not carry business cards. They had Harold Voss in their files. Not as a victim. Not yet. As a person of interest in a pattern they had been mapping for over a year. A pattern of elderly veterans in the Mountain West who had been systematically defrauded of retirement savings, pension payouts, and in some cases the equity in their homes, by a scheme that wore several different faces and left very little traceable behind. What they did not know was that Harold Voss was not a passive victim. He had not been simply swindled and gone quiet. He had spent 2 years doing something very specific, very deliberate, and very dangerous. And the men Hargrove had zip-cuffed in the Callaway General waiting room were the reason it was dangerous. Harold had been collecting evidence, not police evidence, not official, just an old man with a filing system in his apartment on Meridian Street, folders and printed emails and handwritten notes, and a spreadsheet on a 10-year-old laptop that mapped out dates and names and amounts and the specific paper trails that the scheme's architects had believed were invisible. He had kept the existence of this collection from almost everyone. His daughter in Albuquerque knew nothing. His physician knew nothing. The only person who had known was a friend, a man named Walt Greer, who had been in the same Army unit decades ago, whose savings had been one of the first to disappear, who had died of a stroke 8 months ago in a way that Harold had spent a long time trying to convince himself was natural. He had not succeeded in convincing himself. 3 days before his fall on Meridian Street, Harold had been approached by a man outside his apartment building who told him, pleasantly and without apparent threat, that it might be in Harold's interest to stop looking into things that did not concern him. The man had been polite about it. That politeness, Harold had told Lieutenant Hargrove in the 20 minutes before the lieutenant went to make his phone call, had been the most frightening part. The fall was real. He had genuinely slipped on the stairs and fractured his wrist, but the ambulance ride had felt like the first safe thing that had happened to him in weeks, and some part of him had understood that the hospital was his best chance to surface what he knew before it disappeared with him. He had been trying to figure out how to do that, who to tell, how to say it, when 4 men walked through the emergency room doors, and the whole question became suddenly urgent. At 2 in the morning, Nora was charting at the nurse's station when she became aware that something had changed in the quality of the room. She looked up. 2 men had come in through the main entrance, not the same as the 4 from earlier. These 2 were quieter, and they moved differently, and one of them was in plain clothes, and one of them was not. The one who was not wore a jacket with federal identification on it. Not Denton PD, federal. They spoke to Hargrove for less than 3 minutes. Then Hargrove looked across the room toward Bay 4, and he walked over and spoke to the officer he had posted outside Harold's curtain, the protection Daniel had asked him to work faster on, which apparently he had. And the officer stepped aside, and the 2 newcomers went in. Nora watched the curtain close. She did not hear anything from behind it for a long time. At 2:26, a 3rd federal agent arrived and joined the other 2. Then a 4th, a woman in a dark blazer with her hair pulled back, who did not go behind the curtain. She stayed in the waiting area, positioned near the main entrance, and she held a phone to her ear for most of the next hour and said very little on it. Nora's shift ended at 3. She did not leave. She told herself it was because she wanted to see the ortho consult through in the morning, because she was Harold's nurse, and the continuity of care mattered. Both of those things were true. They were also not the full reason. The full reason was that she had stood in front of that bed at 11:47 and made a promise she couldn't take back. And the people who had arrived in the last hour moved like the situation had weight to it she hadn't fully calculated yet. At 3:40, one of the federal agents came out from behind the curtain and approached the nurse's station. "Are you Nora Callahan?" "Yes. I'm Special Agent DeMarco out of the Denver field office. I understand you had significant interaction with Mr. Voss tonight, including at the time of the incident." "He's my patient." "I need to ask you about that interaction. Specifically, anything he said to you before the 4 individuals arrived." She thought about Harold's hand on her wrist. "They found me." She thought about the 2 times he had asked about another exit. She thought about the untouched food on the swing-arm table. "He was frightened," she said. "He asked if there was another way out of the ER, twice. I thought he was just anxious from the fall." DeMarco wrote something. "Did he give you anything, hand you anything, ask you to hold anything for him?" "No, nothing." "Did he say where he'd been in the hours before coming in? Who he'd spoken to?" "He didn't tell me anything about his day." She paused. "He asked about exits. That's it." DeMarco nodded. She had the efficient manner of someone who had conducted a lot of interviews and knew how to tell when a person was being straight with them. "If you think of anything else..." She handed Nora a card. "What's actually happening?" Nora asked. "He's my patient. I have a right to know if there's a safety concern." DeMarco looked at her for a moment. Then she said, "Mr. Voss is a material witness in an ongoing federal investigation. The individuals who came in tonight are connected to the subjects of that investigation. That's what I can tell you." "Is he safe here?" "He's significantly safer here now than he was 3 hours ago. That's also what I can tell you." It was not as much as Nora wanted. It was, she supposed, more than nothing. DeMarco walked back toward the curtain bay. Nora sat at the nurse's station with the card in her hand and thought about what DeMarco had not said, which was probably the more informative part of the conversation. Significantly safer now than 3 hours ago was not the same as safe. The distinction mattered. She looked at the card. Then she looked at the curtain around Bay 4. She was still looking at it when her phone buzzed with a message from the charge nurse who had taken over her station. A routine handoff note, normal shift business, and she was about to reply to it when the curtain of Bay 4 was thrown open from the inside and Harold Voss was sitting bolt upright in bed, his face the color of old concrete, pointing at something on the monitor above his head that was making a sound she recognized immediately. She was already moving before the monitor's alarm reached its 3rd beep. Behind her, she heard DeMarco shout something into her phone. She heard the officer who had been posted outside the curtain say something sharp into his radio. She heard all of it the way you hear things when you're running, processed, noted, assigned to a lower priority. Harold's blood pressure reading on the monitor was 198/114. Hypertensive crisis. She hit the curtain, got through it, reached Harold, and put her hands on him and said clearly, "Harold, I'm here. Stay still." His hand came up and grabbed her wrist. The same hand as before, the same grip. But his eyes, when they met hers, were not the eyes of a man having a medical emergency. They were the eyes of a man who had just seen something. "The bag," he said. His voice came out thin and strained and not quite right. "My bag, from the apartment. They brought it with me in the ambulance." He swallowed. "It's not here." She looked around the bay. The standard hook on the wall where personal belongings were stored had a hospital-issue plastic bag with his wallet and phone and keys. Nothing else. "My bag," Harold said again. "Dark blue. Canvas. I had it when I fell." She looked at the hook again. At the plastic bag. At the empty space beside it. "It's not here, Harold." His grip on her wrist tightened. His blood pressure reading climbed another 4 points. "They found it," he said. "If they found it..." He stopped. His voice had gone quiet in a way that was worse than shouting. Everything was in that bag. From the doorway of the bay, DeMarco was on her phone again. Her voice was low and very fast. and Nora Callahan stood at the bedside of an old man in a hospital gown whose blood pressure was 202 over 116, whose wrist was fractured, whose friend had died 8 months ago, who had been frightened since before he arrived and was more frightened now. And she understood with a cold clarity that whatever had been in that bag, the question of where it was now had just become the most important question in the room. The bag was not a small thing to lose. Nora understood this even before she understood the details, the way you understand a fracture before the X-ray confirms it, something in the angle, something in the sound, something in the way the patient holds the injured part. Harold's face, when he said everything was in that bag, was the face of a man who had just watched the only leverage he had disappear. She stabilized him first because that was the order of things, and because a blood pressure of 202 over 116 was not a backdrop, it was a crisis. She got the attending on call, Dr. Ferris, who arrived in under 3 minutes looking like she had been asleep, but was now fully present in the clipped, efficient way of someone long trained to cross from sleep to function without a visible transition. Nora gave her the numbers, the timeline, the medications already on board, and stepped back to let Ferris work while still staying close enough that Harold could see her face. He was looking at her face instead of the doctor's. She let him. DeMarco had stepped out of the bay to make her calls, which meant the curtain was mostly closed and the space belonged to medicine for the moment. Nora could hear DeMarco's voice outside, low and controlled, but faster than it had been earlier, with a texture that indicated the call was not going the way DeMarco wanted it to go. Dr. Ferris ordered a second antihypertensive, adjusted the dosing, and told Harold in a direct and not unkind voice that he needed to slow his breathing and stop talking for the next 5 minutes, that his body was doing things that required him to get out of its way. Harold looked at Nora. She nodded. "It's okay. Let her work." He closed his eyes. The dark blue canvas bag turned up 17 minutes later, and not in the way anyone expected. Phil, the night security supervisor, found it. He had been reviewing the ambulance bay footage as part of his incident documentation, standard procedure after any significant event in the department, and at the 3-hour mark of the recording, which placed it at approximately 8:50 p.m., before Harold Voss had even arrived, there was a man in the ambulance bay who did not belong there. He was not one of the 4 from the waiting room. He was different, older, wearing a jacket with a medical transport logo that Phil could not immediately verify, and he moved through the ambulance bay with the low-profile confidence of someone who had done this before. He was there for less than 4 minutes. In that window, he went to the storage alcove where paramedic crews left personal items retrieved from patients during transport, and he left with a dark blue canvas bag that had been tagged with an intake number that matched Harold Voss. Phil pulled the footage and brought it to DeMarco at 3:52 in the morning. DeMarco watched it twice without expression. Then she said, "Get me a still from the clearest frame," and Phil got her 3, and she took them and went back to her phone, and the quality of the building's atmosphere shifted in a way that was hard to define precisely, but that everyone in the department could feel. Nora felt it from inside Bay 4, where Harold's pressure had dropped to 178 over 98, and Dr. Ferris was cautiously satisfied with the trajectory. Not good, but no longer the edge of the cliff. "Better," Ferris told him. "Stay flat, no sudden movements." "The bag," Harold said. "We're working on it," Nora said. It was not quite a lie. Someone was working on it. "You don't understand what was in it." "Then tell me." She pulled the chair close to his bedside. Ferris glanced at her, made the calculation that the conversation might do more for his pressure than another medication adjustment, and stepped back. Harold looked at the ceiling for a moment. When he spoke, his voice had settled into something quieter and more deliberate, the voice of a man who had been carrying a weight alone for a long time and had finally reached the point where carrying it alone was no longer possible. 3 years, he said. "That's how long I've been putting it together. Started when my friend Walt lost his savings, $82,000, went to a company called Aldervest Capital Group. They had paperwork, an office address in Denver, a website. Everything looked right. What happened? What happens?" His jaw tightened. 6 months in, the account manager stops answering calls, then the number is disconnected. Then you look up the office address, and it's a mail forwarding service. By the time Walt went to an attorney, there was nothing traceable, nothing to chase. The money was gone and the company had dissolved itself, and the people behind it had already built the next one. He stopped, breathed. Walt wasn't the only one. I found 6 others in Colorado alone, all veterans, all in their late 60s, 70s, all lost between $40,000 and $120,000. One man, his name was Robert Tully, he served in Vietnam, lost the equity on his house. He died the following spring, couldn't afford his medications. Nora sat with that for a second. The bag, Harold said, had a laptop, had printed copies. Bank records I was able to reconstruct through Walt's estate. His daughter gave me access. Shell company filings I pulled from state business databases. And a notebook. He paused. Names. Real names. The people actually running it, not the front men. Where did you get the names? Took me 2 years. He said it without pride, as a plain statement. I spent 2 years finding them. She understood now why the man outside his apartment had been polite about his warning. Polite meant they knew what Harold had. Polite meant they were trying to recover it without creating a noise that would attract the kind of attention they could not manage. The 4 men in the waiting room had not been polite, which meant the polite approach had not worked, or they had run out of time for it, or both. DeMarco came back into the bay at 4:15. She had the specific posture of someone who had received information that had complicated their evening considerably. Mr. Voss, she said, the bag was taken from the ambulance bay earlier tonight. We have footage of the individual who took it. We're working to identify him. Harold closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, he looked like he had expected this. The laptop is encrypted, he said, password protected, and the drive is additionally encrypted. They won't get into it without the password. That's helpful to know. Do you have the password? In my head, Harold said. Not anywhere else. DeMarco nodded. The printed materials are in the bag. I don't have copies anywhere else. I was careful not to. I thought... He stopped. I thought keeping everything in one place was safer, so that if something happened to me, no one else would be involved. Nora watched DeMarco's expression process this. The particular difficulty of the situation was visible for just a moment. An old man's caution had worked against everyone, because the single point of security had become a single point of failure. What about the notebook? DeMarco asked. Harold said nothing. Mr. Voss, the notebook with the names. Harold looked at Nora. It was a strange look, not asking permission exactly, but something adjacent to it. Like he was checking whether the person in front of him was still the same person who had stood in front of his bed at 11:47. She held his gaze and didn't look away. He reached up and pressed 2 fingers to the side of his neck, just below the jaw, in the way of someone checking their own pulse. It was a small gesture, and it seemed irrelevant, and then it seemed like it was not. The notebook, he said carefully, is not in the bag. DeMarco went still. Where is it? Another pause, long enough that Nora became aware of the monitor's steady rhythm above them, the sounds of the department beyond the curtain, the faint noise of DeMarco's colleague speaking on a phone somewhere in the corridor. I had it on me, Harold said. When I fell. The paramedics... He shifted in the bed, and then he stopped shifting because his ribs and his wrist made shifting expensive, and he looked at Nora with something that was almost apology. I think I asked them to keep it with my personal effects. I was confused. I hit my head. Nora looked at the plastic bag on the hook. Wallet, phone, keys. Then she thought about intake processing. The paramedic crew had handled Harold's belongings in the ambulance bay, which was where the canvas bag had ended up and been taken. But items that patients specifically requested be kept with them. Small items, personal items, sometimes came through a different process, tagged separately, filed with admissions. She stood up. I'll be right back, she said. The admissions processing office at 4 a.m. had one person in it, a young man named Torres, who had 3 monitors open and a podcast playing quietly through one earbud, and who looked up when Nora came through the door with the expression of someone who was not expecting company. Harold Voss, she said. Intake tonight, around 9:30. Ambulance transport. Is there a separate personal items log from the paramedic crew? Torres pulled up the intake record, scrolled. There's a notation here from the transport team. Patient requested a small item be kept separately from transport bag, listed as, he squinted at the screen, spiral notebook, brown cover, approximately 6 by 4 inches, placed in admission secure hold pending patient request. He looked at her. Where's the secure hold? She asked. He pointed at a cabinet on the wall behind him. 20 minutes later, Nora was standing in Bay 4 holding a brown spiral notebook, while DeMarco stood across the bed from her, and Harold Voss watched both of them with the exhausted alertness of someone who has not slept and is not going to sleep, not yet, not until he knows whether what he built over 3 years is still worth something. DeMarco took the notebook carefully, as though it might decide to be different than what it appeared to be. She opened it to the first page, read for 30 seconds. Her expression did not change, but she picked up her phone. The call she made at 4:38 in the morning woke someone up. Nora could tell from the rhythm of the conversation, DeMarco's half of it crisp and sequential, the pauses slightly longer than they would be with someone already at a desk, the tone adjusted for a person who needed a moment to fully arrive at the situation. What DeMarco said, in the portions audible from inside the bay, was, yes, names, at least 14, some with documentation cross-referenced to the financial records. No, we don't have the laptop yet, but we have the notebook. Yes, I think we need to move tonight. Nora gave Harold water. She checked his pressure, 162/94, still high but no longer alarming, settling in the way of a system that has been through significant stress and is finding its floor. Ferris had left orders for an additional check at 5 and a physician review at 7. The ortho consult was still scheduled for morning. In the bed, Harold had the look of a man who has been holding a door shut for a long time and has finally been allowed to step back. Walt would have liked this, he said, the part where it started to matter. Nora didn't say anything. She straightened his blanket. He used to say the problem with old people is that nobody thinks we're capable of doing anything about anything anymore. Harold watched the ceiling. He was funny, Walt, better with words than me. You did pretty well, Nora said. He almost smiled. It was the first time she had seen anything close to it. At 5:10, something changed. Not in Bay 4. In the parking structure adjacent to the hospital, the 3-level structure on the east side that handled both staff and visitor parking and connected to the main building via a covered walkway on the second level. The security camera on level 2 had been showing an uninterrupted feed of an empty concrete floor and 3 parked cars since midnight. At 5:10, it showed something different. Phil was the one who saw it, because Phil was still at his station working through the footage documentation. And because Phil was, by nature, and by 22 years of doing this job, thorough. He had been reviewing the parking structure cameras as a routine extension of his incident documentation. And at 5:10, he sat forward in his chair and picked up his radio. He called DeMarco's number directly because DeMarco had given it to him 3 hours ago, and because what he was looking at was not something he wanted to route through normal channels. On the level 2 walkway camera, 2 men. Not the 4 from earlier, different men. One of them was carrying something under his jacket that created a particular outline, and the walkway they were on connected directly to the main building's eastern corridor, which ran past radiology, past the pharmacy, and terminated at the emergency department. DeMarco was on her feet before Phil finished talking. She said 4 words into her own phone. We need backup now. And then she was moving through the bay curtain and into the corridor, and Nora heard her go, heard the shift in the department's atmosphere that had been building since 5 in the morning become something sharper and louder, heard Phil's radio burst with a second voice and then a third. She looked at Harold. He had heard it too. She could tell from his face that he had understood the particular quality of that sound. The sound of a situation accelerating past the point where normal procedures apply. Stay flat, she said. Don't move. Whatever you hear, stay in this bed. Nora, I mean it. She stepped out of the bay. The eastern corridor was at the far end of the department, 30 meters of hallway between the main ER space and the connecting walkway. Phil's 2 overnight security guards were moving toward it. DeMarco's colleague, the agent who had been stationed near the main entrance, was crossing the room at a run with his jacket open and his hand at his side. What stopped all of them, what stopped the room, stopped everyone in the middle of whatever they were doing, was the sound from the walkway door. Not a gunshot. Not yet. A voice. Loud, male, carrying the flat, effectless quality of someone who has made a decision and is announcing it as a condition rather than a request. Harold Voss, we just need the notebook. Send out whoever has it, and everyone else goes home. Nora stood in the middle of the emergency department at 5:14 in the morning and understood two things simultaneously. The first was that the men in the walkway did not know DeMarco already had the notebook, which meant they were operating on information that was at least 45 minutes old, which meant their network inside the hospital, however it worked, had a lag. That was something. The second was that they did not know what DeMarco knew and what she did not know, which meant they did not know exactly where the investigation stood, which meant they were here to recover the situation before it could go further, and they were willing to come into a hospital at 5 in the morning to do it, which said something significant about how much time they believed they had left. DeMarco was 10 feet from Nora. She looked at her, a fast, assessing look, the look of someone rapidly inventorying what resources she has and where they are. And she said very quietly, "Stay with your patient. Don't leave that bay." Nora nodded. DeMarco moved toward the walkway. Nora went back behind the curtain. Harold was sitting up despite her instructions, which she had expected, and she pushed him gently back down and put her hand on his sternum the way she would with any patient who needed to understand that lying still was not a request. "They don't know she has the notebook," Nora said. "DeMarco has it. It's already done, Harold. Whatever happens out there, what you built is already in the right hands." He looked up at her. His eyes were red-rimmed and very clear. "How many of them?" he asked. "I don't know. 2 on camera, maybe more." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The names in that notebook. There are people in that list who have been doing this for 11 years. Veterans all over this region. There are names in there that cross state lines. I know. If anything happens, nothing is going to happen." She kept her voice level. "Stay down." From the corridor, she heard DeMarco's voice, measured, professional, the voice of someone who has been trained to talk to people who have made bad decisions and who still believes, even now, that the talking is worth trying. Then she heard a second voice from the walkway respond, and what it said made the agent near the main entrance move his hand to his radio and made Phil's voice on the security channel go sharp and brief. And then, from somewhere outside the hospital, from the direction of the parking lot on the west side, the side that the walkway did not face, the side that had been quiet all night, there was the sound of 2 vehicles arriving at speed, not police sirens. The vehicles did not have sirens on, but they were moving fast, and they stopped hard, and the sounds that followed, doors, footsteps, voices carrying the specific cadence of people who had been briefed and were moving with a shared objective, were not the sounds of Denton PD's overnight patrol. DeMarco heard it too. Nora could tell because DeMarco's posture, visible through the narrow gap in the curtain, changed in a way that was small but legible. A slight release in the shoulders, a breath that went in and did not come out immediately held. Whatever she had called for at 4:38 had arrived, and then the walkway door opened. The man who came through it first was not one of the 2 they had seen on camera. He was moving differently than anyone who had come through any door of Callaway General tonight, with a precision and a quietness that was not the quietness of someone trying to be undetected, but the quietness of someone who simply did not make unnecessary sounds, because unnecessary sounds had never, in his experience, been useful. He was wearing civilian clothes. He had a gray jacket, and Daniel Reese looked at the room, at DeMarco, at the agent by the entrance, at Phil, at the curtain where Nora was standing very still. And he said nothing, because the situation did not require him to say anything, and then he turned back toward the walkway, and 2 men came through behind him who were not in civilian clothes and who were not from Denton PD, and whose presence in that corridor at 5:14 in the morning, Nora understood with a slow and total certainty, was not a coincidence. She looked at Daniel. He met her eyes through the gap in the curtain for just a moment. Then he looked past her, toward where Harold was lying in the bed, and something crossed his face that was not quite recognition and not quite relief and was not nothing. DeMarco said, very carefully, "Mr. Reese, what exactly is your involvement in this?" Daniel turned to look at her. And for the first time since she had watched him stand up from a plastic chair 4 hours ago, the expression on his face was not the careful neutral of a man keeping himself contained. It was something else, something older than tonight. "I've been looking for Harold Voss for 8 months, he said. The corridor went quiet in the way that rooms go quiet, when something has shifted underneath the surface of events, and everyone present can feel it, but no one is yet sure what to do with the feeling. DeMarco looked at Daniel for a long moment. She had the expression of someone rapidly reclassifying information, not thrown, not rattled, but recalibrating, the way a navigator adjusts when the landmark they expected turns out to be something different and more significant than the map indicated. 8 months, she said. Walt Greer was my uncle, Daniel said. My mother's brother. He died in March. The room held that. DeMarco let 3 seconds pass before she spoke again. You should have disclosed that at intake. I didn't know Harold was here until I got the call from the task force coordinator at 2:30 this morning. I'd been on their peripheral contact list since October. When my daughter's ankle turned out to be a sprain and not a fracture, I was already leaving when the call came in. He paused. I came back. You came back with 2 federal marshals. I called in a favor. DeMarco looked at the 2 men who had come through the walkway door behind Daniel. They had the particular stillness of people who did not need to announce themselves and were not going to. One of them produced credentials. DeMarco looked at them, looked back at Daniel, and made the kind of decision that people in her position make when the alternative is a conversation that will take longer than the situation allows. We'll talk about the rest of this later, she said. Right now I need to know what's in that walkway. 2 men, possibly a third in the stairwell on the north end. They came in from the parking structure, so east side entrance, level 2. Daniel's voice had the flat specificity of a briefing, not a conversation. The one doing the talking has a shoulder holster. The other one is carrying something in his right jacket pocket that's too heavy for a phone. They're not here to shoot anyone. They're here to recover or destroy the evidence and leave. But that changes if they feel cornered. How do you know that? Because if they wanted to shoot someone, they would have done it before announcing themselves. DeMarco processed this. Then she turned to her colleague by the main entrance and gave him 3 quick instructions, and he moved toward the north stairwell, and one of the marshals behind Daniel repositioned to cover the walkway door from an angle, and the shape of the room changed again. Nora watched all of it from behind the curtain of Bay 4. She had one hand on Harold's shoulder, not restraining him, just present, just making sure he knew she was still there. Is that the man from before? Harold asked. The one in the gray jacket? Yes. Harold was quiet for a moment. Walt talked about his nephew sometimes, said he worried about the boy. He's not much of a boy. No, Harold said. I imagine not. The 2 men in the walkway did not come further into the building. What happened instead was a negotiation that lasted 11 minutes and was conducted mostly by DeMarco, who stood at the walkway door and spoke through it with the careful, unhurried patience of someone who understood that the men on the other side had run out of good options and needed time to understand that themselves. The man who had been doing the talking, his name, they would learn later, was Breslin, mid-level coordinator for the network's Western operations. Tried twice to reframe the situation as a misunderstanding. DeMarco let him try. She did not argue with him. She simply waited, and when he finished, she told him in specific terms what she already had and where it was and how far the call she had made at 4:38 had already traveled, and she told him that the 2 choices available to him had a clear difference in outcome and that the window for the better one was closing. At minute 9, Breslin asked for a guarantee. DeMarco said she could not make guarantees. She could describe the difference between cooperating and not cooperating, which she did, in the same unhurried tone. And she could tell him that the men already in custody, Garrett Peel and his 3, had been in an interview room since 2 in the morning, which meant that whatever calculation Breslin was making about what was already known needed to account for that. At minute 11, Breslin came through the door with his hands visible. The 3rd man in the stairwell, when DeMarco's colleague reached him, had already put his jacket on the ground. It was not clean. It was not the way these things look in the versions people tell later. Breslin's hands were shaking when the marshal took his jacket, and he said something under his breath that no one could quite hear. And the other man from the walkway sat down on the floor of the corridor without being asked and put his head in his hands and stayed that way for a long time. Nora saw none of this directly. She heard it. The voices, the movement, the particular quality of silence that comes after a situation resolves. She stayed in Bay 4. At 5:43, DeMarco came back through the curtain. She looked at Harold first, then at Nora. "It's clear," she said. Harold closed his eyes. His blood pressure reading, when Nora checked it, was 154/91, still elevated, coming down. It keeps. Daniel was in the corridor when Nora finally came out of the bay. He was standing against the wall with his arms crossed, watching DeMarco's team work, and he looked like a man who had run a long way and had arrived somewhere and was not yet sure what to do with the arrival. She stopped beside him. "Walt Greer," she said. He looked at her. "You heard?" "Some of it." He nodded slowly. He had the expression of someone deciding how much of a story they want to tell in a hospital corridor at 6 in the morning, which was a specific and limited expression. "He left me a message," Daniel said. 3 days before he died. Said he had found someone who might be building a case. Said he thought something might actually come of it. He looked down the corridor toward where DeMarco was standing with the brown spiral notebook and an evidence bag. "He didn't give me Harold's name. He was careful about that. Said he didn't want to put anyone at risk." "Did you know about the scheme before he died?" "I knew Walt had lost money. He told me 6 months before that he'd been taken. 82,000. His jaw moved. "I tried to help him track it. I had resources that civilians don't have access to, contacts from my time and from before. But whoever built this thing built it well. The front companies dissolved before we could trace them. Every time we found a thread, it had already been cut. And then Walt died. And then Walt died. He said it the same way Harold had said everything was in that bag. Flat, containing more weight than the words themselves could carry. I kept looking. I was off the official radar. I'm not law enforcement. I don't have standing. I was just a man running down a cold trail through public records and old contacts. 8 months of it." He paused. "I didn't know Harold existed until 4 months ago. By the time I found out someone had been building a parallel case, I didn't know where he was, or how far along he was, or if he was still—" He stopped. "Still alive?" Nora said. "I was going to say still active," Daniel said. But yes, she thought about Harold asking her, twice, if there was another exit. She thought about the untouched dinner tray, and the blood pressure reading, and the way he had grabbed her wrist and said they found me with the voice of someone who had expected this and had hoped they were wrong. "He knew they were getting close," she said. "The man who warned him outside his building. That was recent. 3 days ago." Daniel had that information already, which meant DeMarco had shared it, or he'd been briefed by the marshals, or both. They found him through a records request he made last month to the state business registry. He was looking up one of the shell companies. The search left a trace. He didn't know that. No. He thought he was being careful. He was careful, mostly. But they have people who watch for that kind of inquiry. Nora looked down the corridor. Through the window at the end, the sky outside was beginning to shift. Not yet light, but no longer fully dark. The particular gray of early morning that belongs to neither. "You weren't just waiting for your daughter's X-ray," she said, "earlier tonight, when you were sitting there." Daniel was quiet for a moment. "I was waiting for my daughter's X-ray," he said. "That part was real. Callie's ankle is real." Another pause. "But when I saw the 4 men come in, I recognized the way they moved. I've seen that kind of approach before. And I knew Harold's general area of residence from my search. When I heard his name," he stopped. "I didn't have a plan. I just stood up. That seems to be a thing you do." He almost smiled. It was a small thing, and it passed quickly, but it was there. By 7 in the morning, the emergency department had returned to something resembling its normal rhythm. The shift change brought new nurses, new faces, the particular organized chaos of a department that does not stop for anything, and had not stopped for last night either. Patients moved through. The chairs in the waiting room filled and emptied and filled again. Harold had been moved to a private room on the third floor at 6:30, which was DeMarco's request and the hospital administrator's decision, and which involved two of the marshals maintaining a presence in the corridor outside his door. The ortho consult was rescheduled for 9. His blood pressure was 148/88, and the attending physician had adjusted his medications and was cautiously optimistic about the trajectory. Nora did not go home when her shift ended. She went upstairs. She told herself it was to check on him before the ortho team arrived, to make sure the transition had been documented properly, to close the loop on the care she had started. All of that was true. She also just wanted to see that he was in the room, that the room was real, that the night had produced something more durable than its own exhaustion. Harold was awake when she came in. He had the breakfast tray on the swing arm table, and he was looking at it with the expression of a man who understands he should eat, but is not yet ready to pretend that appetite is available. "Toast," Nora said. "Start with toast." "I was never a big breakfast person. That's not a medical opinion, that's a preference. Toast." He picked up a triangle of toast. He took one bite and put it down. "The agent," he said. "DeMarco. She was here this morning, early." "What did she say?" "She said the notebook is enough to open formal charges against at least 9 individuals. And with the laptop, once their technical people get access, she expects that number to go higher." He looked at his hands. "She said it will take time, that these things always take time. Does that bother you?" He thought about it. 6 months ago it would have, he said. Now I'm just... He searched for the word. "Tired." "You should be." "Not that kind of tired." He looked up at her. "The other kind. The kind where you've been carrying something for so long that when you finally put it down, your body doesn't know what to do with the space." Nora thought about the first time she had seen that look. Not on Harold, but on a patient she'd had in her second year, a woman in her 50s who had finally left a situation she had been trying to leave for a long time, and who had come into the ER not because of the situation itself, but because her body had finally, once the situation was over, allowed itself to be sick, as though it had been holding illness at bay for as long as holding was required. "That kind of tired is actually okay," Nora said. "That's your body deciding it's safe enough to feel things." He looked at her for a moment. Then he picked up the toast again and ate the rest of it. At 9:45, while Harold was in his ortho consult and Nora was finally thinking seriously about going home, DeMarco found her in the third-floor corridor. "I need 5 minutes," DeMarco said. They found a family consultation room, small and quiet, and smelling of the particular institutional nothing that hospital rooms smell of, and DeMarco sat across from her with a folder and a recorder and spent 20 minutes taking a formal statement about everything Nora had seen and heard from 11:47 onward. At the end of it, DeMarco turned off the recorder. "Off the record," she said. Nora nodded. The network Harold documented, Aldervest Capital Group and the entities that followed it, has been operating for 11 years. We have confirmed victims in Colorado, Wyoming, New Mexico, and Nevada. At minimum 400 individuals, predominantly elderly veterans. Aggregate loss, based on what we currently have, is somewhere between $40 and $60 million. Nora sat with that number. The 9 individuals whose names are in Harold's notebook, DeMarco continued, include 2 people who currently hold positions in legitimate financial advisory firms in Colorado. 1 person who sits on the board of a veterans outreach organization in Denver, which, for the record, is how they identified their targets, and 1 person who works in the Colorado State Department of Revenue, which is how they kept the shell companies clean. Someone inside the government. Someone inside the government, DeMarco confirmed, which is why this investigation has been running quietly for 14 months and why the task force I work with is joint federal rather than state. She paused. Harold didn't know about the government connection. He documented it without knowing what it meant. He thought the man's name was just another investor. He didn't know the name was the reason the paper trail kept going cold. Nora thought about an old man in an apartment on Meridian Street, building a spreadsheet on a 10-year-old laptop, pulling state business database records, reconstructing bank trails through a dead friend's estate, building something true without knowing the full shape of what he was building. He found the keystone without knowing it was the keystone, she said. DeMarco looked at her. That's exactly right. Is he going to be protected, going forward after he leaves the hospital? He'll be relocated temporarily, voluntary. There are things we need him for over the coming weeks. The laptop password, his testimony, his identification of the methodology. After that, we're working with the DA's office on long-term arrangements. DeMarco folded her hands on the folder. He's not going back to Meridian Street. Does he know that? We told him this morning. How did he take it? DeMarco was quiet for a moment. He asked if he could take his laptop. Nora almost laughed. It came out instead as a breath, a small, unsteady one, and she pressed the back of her hand against her mouth for a second until it passed. He can take the laptop, DeMarco said, after we've copied the drive. The piece that Nora did not know yet, the piece that would surface later that day, when she was home and finally asleep and would not know about it until the following morning, was what had been found in the canvas bag. The bag had been recovered at 6:20 from a vehicle parked on the street 2 blocks from the hospital. The man on the ambulance bay footage, identified by noon the following day as a logistics contractor who had worked for 3 of Aldervest's successor entities, had not gotten far. The bag's contents were intact except for a manila envelope that had been opened and resealed badly, which told the task force that someone had seen what was inside it and had made a decision about what to do with that information before being picked up. The manila envelope contained printed bank records showing a series of wire transfers, small amounts, moved through 3 intermediary accounts over 14 months, that terminated in an account registered to a private consulting firm in Fort Collins. The consulting firm, when cross-referenced with the Secretary of State's business registry, had 2 listed principals. One of them was Marcus Alderton, a name already in Harold's notebook, already on DeMarco's list. The other one had not appeared anywhere in the investigation before that morning. The other one was a name that DeMarco recognized from a different context entirely. A context that had nothing to do with financial fraud and everything to do with the task force's own internal communications over the past 14 months. She saw the name at 7:40 in the morning in a preliminary report from the evidence recovery team. She read it twice. Then she closed her laptop and sat at the table in the hospital conference room that had become her temporary office for the last 4 hours. And she thought about what it meant that the investigation had just found a thread that led back inside. She had made 3 phone calls before 8. None of them were to people inside her direct chain of command. That was deliberate. By 9:15, 2 of those calls had produced results that changed the shape of the morning considerably, and the third had produced a very long silence, followed by a question she had not expected. "How long have you known?" "Since 40 minutes ago," DeMarco said. Another silence. "Then you need to move faster than you think," the voice said, "because if I know you found this, other people are going to know too, and some of those people are going to want to make sure this particular thread doesn't go anywhere. It hasn't already gone." DeMarco had ended the call and sat for a moment with the specific weight of a situation that had just become significantly more dangerous than it had been when the night started. The investigation had found a leak inside itself, and whoever it was, they now had, at most, a few hours before they understood that the canvas bag had been recovered, the envelope opened, and the name inside it was no longer a secret. At 9:47, DeMarco walked back to Harold's room with 2 marshals and a look on her face that Nora, who happened to be standing in the corridor when she passed, could not quite read. It was not the look of someone finishing something. It was the look of someone who had just realized that the thing they were finishing was considerably larger than the room they could currently see. The name in the envelope was Raymond Solis. DeMarco had known Raymond Solis for 3 years. Not well. Not socially, not in the way of people who share meals or personal details, but professionally, in the way of people who attend the same interagency briefings and read the same classified summaries and occasionally pass each other in corridors and exchange the kind of nod that means, "I know what you do and you know what I do, and that's the extent of it." Solis worked financial intelligence coordination for the State Attorney General's office. He had been, on paper, one of the people whose cooperation had made the joint task force possible. He had also, apparently, been the reason the task force kept finding threads that had already been cut. She did not allow herself to sit with the implications longer than necessary, because sitting with implications was not, At this moment, the most useful thing she could do. What was useful was speed and sequencing and the careful management of who knew what and in what order, because the moment Solis understood that the canvas bag had been recovered, which would happen as soon as whoever he had inside the evidence chain made contact, the window for a clean arrest closed. The two marshals she brought back to Harold's room were not for Harold. They were for the next 40 minutes. She told Harold, clearly and without excessive detail, that the investigation had taken a turn that required her to move quickly, and that his safety during that window was her first operational priority. Harold looked at her with the eyes of a man who had spent 3 years learning to read the space between what people said and what they meant. "You found something else," he said. "We found something else." "In the bag?" "In the bag." He nodded slowly. He did not ask what. He had enough experience with the shape of these situations to understand that asking what would produce either a lie or a non-answer, and he was too tired for either. "Do what you need to do," he said. Done. Raymond Solis was arrested at 11:22 in the morning at his office in the State Attorney General's building in Denver. He was not at his desk when the two federal agents arrived. He was in the second-floor corridor, moving toward the parking garage elevator, carrying his laptop bag and a jacket, and moving with the particular purposeful pace of a man who has somewhere very specific to be and would prefer not to discuss it. The agents were already in the corridor when he came through the stairwell door. He stopped. He looked at them. He looked at the badge one of them was holding. He looked at the elevator. He made the calculation in about 2 seconds. Then he set his laptop bag on the floor and put his hands up, because Raymond Solis was, whatever else he was, not a man who did not understand when the numbers had stopped working in his favor. He said, "I want an attorney." Those were the last words he spoke voluntarily for the rest of that day. His laptop, recovered from the bag on the corridor floor, contained, once the technical team cracked the encryption 2 days later, 14 months of internal task force communications, annotated with dates and notations that showed when and how Solis had passed information about the investigation's progress to an intermediary connected to Aldervest's successor entities. He had not been doing it for money, which surprised some people and did not surprise others. He had done it because 7 years ago he had made a decision that put him inside these people's reach, and they had held it there ever since. And what had started as coercion had eventually become something more complicated and less innocent than coercion, the way those things do when they go on long enough. None of that made it forgivable. It made it human, which is not the same thing. The formal charges were filed over the following 10 days. Garrett Peel, the big man with the scar, the one who had grabbed Nora's arm in the emergency room, was charged with criminal conspiracy, witness intimidation, and aggravated assault. He took a plea at day 8, providing testimony against 3 of the network's upper-level coordinators in exchange for a reduced sentence that was still, by any reasonable measure, significant. Breslin, the man from the walkway, cooperated immediately and extensively. He had the particular quality of someone who had understood from the moment DeMarco told him what she already had, that the correct move was not loyalty to a network that had never, in his experience, demonstrated loyalty downward. His cooperation produced 6 additional names that had not been in Harold's notebook and confirmed 2 that had. Marcus Alderton, the name that had appeared in both Harold's notebook and the Fort Collins consulting firm, was arrested in Nevada on day 4, attempting to board a private flight to Mexico with a passport that was not in his real name. The passport was good enough to fool a casual inspection and not good enough to fool a federal watch list that had been updated at 6:15 the previous morning. The Veterans Outreach Organization in Denver, the one whose board included one of the named individuals, the one that had been used to identify targets, was shut down by court order on day 11. Its donor records, membership lists, and event registrations were seized as evidence. The organization's legitimate staff, the people who had worked there in good conscience, running programs for elderly veterans, not knowing what the board above them was doing, found out the same way the public found out, which was badly and all at once, and several of them gave statements to local news that were painful to read. The Colorado State Department of Revenue conducted an internal audit of the division where Solis's contact had worked. The audit took 3 weeks and produced a secondary referral to the Inspector General's office that was, as of the time the main investigation concluded, still ongoing. 41 additional victims were identified through the laptop's records. Combined with the victims already documented in Harold's files, the confirmed total reached 463 individuals across 5 states. Average loss per victim, $89,000. The oldest victim was 89 years old, a former Army staff sergeant from Casper, Wyoming, who had lost his savings and the money his wife had left him when she died of cancer, and who had been told by every financial institution he approached that there was nothing to be done. There was, it turned out, something to be done. It had just required an old man with a 10-year-old laptop and 3 years of patience to find the door. Nora heard most of this secondhand in pieces over the weeks that followed. Some of it came from DeMarco, who called her twice, once to thank her for her statement, once to tell her that her testimony about the events of that night had been included in the formal case file and might be needed for depositions. Some of it came from the local news coverage, which was extensive for the first week, and then became the background noise of an ongoing story that the public followed at the pace such stories move, which is slower than anyone expects, and faster than the justice system prefers. She went back to work the day after the night that had not ended until well past noon. She worked her shift. She charted, sutured, monitored, discharged, held hands, explained diagnoses in plain language, handled a 3-car accident at 2 in the afternoon that brought in 6 patients simultaneously and required the kind of focused improvisation that emergency nursing requires, and that she knew, genuinely good at. She did not feel like a hero. She felt like someone who had stood in a spot at the wrong time and made the only decision that seemed available, and then had kept making decisions because the situation kept requiring them. That was different from heroism in a way she found important, though she couldn't always explain why. Her charge nurse, a woman named Priya, who had been doing this job for 18 years and who had seen a lot of what hospitals see, stopped her in the corridor on day 3 and said, without preamble, "You know what you did, right?" "I did my job," Nora said. Priya looked at her with the expression of someone who is deciding not to argue a point they've already made. "Okay," she said, and then, "The ortho attending said Harold Voss sent a card to the department." Nora stopped. "A card?" "Paper. Handwritten. Apparently he has opinions about email." Priya handed it to her. The card was a plain one, the kind you buy at a pharmacy. Harold's handwriting was small and cramped, slightly uneven. The hand of someone writing with a wrist that had been recently set in a cast. It said, "Thank you for not moving. Some of us needed someone to hold the line. You did. HV." Nora stood in the corridor and read it twice, then she folded it along its original crease and put it in the pocket of her scrubs, where she found it again at the end of her shift and transferred it to her bag. She still had it 3 months later. Daniel Reese did not disappear. She had half expected him to. Had expected that the gray jacket and the paperback and the controlled precision and the 8 months of quiet searching would resolve into the particular kind of person who recedes after the event, who slips out of the story the way they had entered it, without announcement. There was a version of that night where she never saw him again. That was not the version that happened. He called her 6 days after. He got her number from a mutual channel she would have thought was secure and would later find out was not particularly. He said, on the phone, "I wanted to check in, on you, not the situation, on you." She had been surprised enough to say, "Why?" "Because you were the one standing in front of the bed," he said. "Everyone else showed up later. You were there first. Those things have a cost, and I wanted to ask if the bill had come due yet." It was the most direct thing anyone had said to her about that night, and it was so direct that she didn't have a smooth answer for it, and so she told him the truth, which was that yes, actually, the bill had come due about 2 days in when she had woken up at 3 in the morning with her heart going and a very clear memory of the sound of Harold's monitor when his pressure had spiked, and that she had sat on the edge of her bed for 20 minutes before it resolved. "Yeah," he said, "that sounds about right." They met for coffee twice in the following month. Not dates, not exactly, or not consciously, not in the way she could point to and name, more like 2 people who had been in the same place on the same night and found that they had more to say to each other than that single night should have produced. He told her about Walt. She told him about why she had gone into emergency medicine, which was a thing she did not often talk about because the reason was personal and slightly embarrassing in the way that true motivations often are. He did not find it embarrassing. He listened the way he did everything, with a stillness that was not passivity but attention, actual attention, the kind that had become rare enough that she noticed it. He was not easy to know. He had rooms he did not open. There were things he had seen and done that had left marks he did not always explain, and she could see them the way you see load-bearing walls. Not directly, but by the shape they gave to everything around them. He was working through his own particular version of that 3 a.m. bill, and he was doing it the way he did everything else, quietly, without performance, with the stubbornness of someone who has decided that functioning is non-negotiable even when functioning is hard. He was not perfect. He was occasionally distant when he should have been present. He was better at action than at sitting still with uncertainty. He made coffee too strong and thought everyone's tolerance for it was the same as his. She was not perfect either. She knew that. She had her own load-bearing walls. Insgesamt. Harold Voss left Colorado in the 3rd week after his discharge. The relocation was temporary. DeMarco's word, and DeMarco meant it. But temporary in federal investigation terms meant a minimum of several months. And Harold had seemed, when Nora saw him briefly in the week before he left, to have made a kind of peace with that. He came to the hospital once, in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon, unannounced. He had a cast on his left wrist, and a cane he was using with the slight self-consciousness of someone who has recently accepted a piece of equipment they previously refused to consider. He asked for her at the nurse's station and waited in the same plastic chairs where he had spent the worst night of the last 3 years. "I wanted to see it," he said when she came out. "In the daytime." She sat beside him. The waiting room in the afternoon was its own different world, crowded, noisy, children, adults, the ordinary clamor of people who needed help with ordinary things. "How are you doing?" she asked. "Better than I deserve and worse than I'd like," he said. "That's my honest answer." That might be everyone's honest answer. He smiled at that. The full version this time, not the almost. It changed his face considerably. She realized she had not seen it before and that she was glad she was seeing it now. "Walt would have wanted to meet you," he said. She didn't have the right answer for that. She just nodded. "I've been thinking about what comes next," Harold said. "The task force coordinator, the new one, after the Solis situation. She mentioned that the victim identification process is going to take time. Finding all the people who were affected, contacting them, helping them understand what's available to them through the recovery proceedings. That's a lot of work." "It is." He looked at his hands. The cast was pale blue. His daughter had insisted on color, he had told Nora, and he had let her choose because she had driven from Albuquerque in 5 hours when she found out what had happened, and that kind of driving deserved a concession. "I told the coordinator I'd like to help, with the outreach. I know how these people think. I know what questions they're going to have, and what fears they're going to have, and how to talk to someone who has spent years believing that nothing can be done about anything." Nora looked at him. "What did she say?" "She said she'd think about it." He paused. "I think she meant yes." Nora thought about Robert Tully, the Vietnam veteran Harold had mentioned in the hospital, the man who had lost his house equity and his savings and his wife's legacy, and who had died the following spring without enough money for his medications. She thought about 463 people across 5 states who had believed the same thing, that nothing could be done, that the people who had taken from them were too smart and too protected and too embedded for an old man with a laptop to matter. She thought about what it meant that they had been wrong. "I think she meant yes, too," Nora said. The formal recognition came in the 5th month. Nora had not asked for it. She had in fact indicated clearly in a conversation with the hospital's administrative director that she was not interested in any ceremony that involved her standing at a podium while people looked at her. The administrative director had listened respectfully and then done exactly what administrators do, which was balance her preferences against institutional interests and find a middle path that served the institution and could be framed as serving her. There was a small event, not a podium, but a room. The hospital's main conference room, 24 people, the department she worked in, and a few people from outside it. DeMarco attended, which Nora had not expected. 2 members of the task force attended. Harold called in on video from wherever the relocation had taken him. He was wearing a clean shirt and his cast was still blue, and said, in about 45 seconds, the most precise and economical thing anyone said that day. She didn't do what she did because she knew what would happen, Harold said. She didn't know. Nobody knew. She did it because there was a person in a bed who needed someone to stand between them and something dangerous, and she was the person who was there. He paused. That's what courage actually is. Not knowing and doing it anyway. Everything else is just the story we tell after. Nora stood in the front row and looked at her shoes for most of this because looking at her shoes was more manageable than looking at the room. When it was over and people were moving toward the table with the coffee and the pastries that someone had ordered, Daniel found her near the window. He had come without announcement. She had not told him about the event, and he had found out through channels she had stopped trying to trace. And he was wearing a jacket that was not gray, which she noted as a change. Good speech, he said. Harold's, specifically. He's good with words, Nora said. He told me that about his friend Walt, and I think he was being modest. He was being modest. She looked out the window. The day was overcast, the specific Colorado overcast of late fall that turns the mountains a flat gray blue in the distance, beautiful in a way that requires a particular mood to appreciate. I've been thinking about something, she said. Okay. About why I became a nurse. She had told him this, the version she had told him over coffee, the actual version, the one that was slightly embarrassing in the way of true things. Her grandmother, who had been the person who mattered most in her early life, had died in a hospital after a long illness, and what Nora remembered most clearly was not the death, but a specific night 6 weeks before it. A nurse who had sat with her grandmother at 2 a.m. when Nora had gone home to sleep, and who had just been present, and who had made her grandmother feel that the room she was dying in was not empty. Nora had been 12. She had not understood what she was watching. She had understood it later. You told me, Daniel said. I know, I've been thinking about it differently since all this. She turned from the window. I thought the job was about holding the line, making sure the bad things don't get to the people who can't stop them. And it is, partly. But Harold said something that first night that I keep coming back to. What did he say? He said he felt safe in the hospital, like the ambulance ride was the first safe thing that had happened in weeks. She paused. He wasn't talking about the building. He was talking about people in the building who acted like his safety mattered. And I think that's the difference between a hospital and just a building. It's whether the people in it actually treat the patients like their safety matters, not because they have to, because they decided it does. Daniel was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Walt told me once that the only thing that actually scares powerful people is someone ordinary deciding they're not going to look away. He was right. He usually was. It was an irritating quality. She almost laughed. It came out as the real thing. On.